History of Cities. Episode 2, Running in the 490s. Last time, we left off with the end of the Ionian Revolt. This 6-year rebellion had consequences on both sides that would guarantee another conflict in the near future. For the Greeks, the revolt had been a catalyst for the spreading of the idea of a sort of Hellenic proto-nationalism that centered around the Greeks' desire to break away from the Persian Empire. The formerly fractious and competitive city-states were beginning to become more united as they saw their only hope at defeating the much stronger Persians was solidarity and cooperation. On the other hand, the Persians saw the events of the revolt as proof that they needed to stamp out the rebellious spirit of the Hellenic world and that their armies were far superior in both numbers and combat prowess. To this end, almost immediately after the final remnants of the Ionian revolt were squashed, Darius began planning his invasion of Greece proper. By the year 493 BC, the Persians had re-established complete control over Anatolia, and a later campaign in 492 BC regained the Persian foothold on the west of the Aegean, when they retook the province of Thrace and subjugated the kingdom of Macedonia. Rather than rest on his laurels, Darius decided now was as good a time as any to press his advantage. In the mind of Darius, Greece was an obnoxious thorn in his side that would continue to foment rebellion in his western provinces unless he took this chance to completely suppress the troublesome Greeks. Darius bore a grudge against the cities of Athens and Eretria for their support of the rebellion, even though they had only participated in one battle before running away back to Greece. With this in mind, and the fact that armies were already mustered in the western provinces, the invasion would surely begin imminently. Before we get into the meat of the First Greco-Persian War, I want to take some time to go over what military engagements were like between these peoples at this point in time. The Persian Empire was massive, stretching from Anatolia in the west to India in the east, and from Egypt in the south to the Caucasus in the north. From this vast territory, they were able to support a professional national army of around 150,000 men, which was supported by tens of thousands of reserves drawn from allies. The Persians preferred missile and cavalry tactics, in which their infantry created formations that consisted of a line of shield bearers that would protect a corps of archers. The cavalry would begin by harassing the flanks of the enemy with missiles in order to force them to bunch up. These bunches were then easy targets for the mass archery corps. The Greek army consisted primarily of hoplites. Hoplites were citizen, so non-professional soldiers that specialized in hand-to-hand combat. Due to their close-quarters mode of combat, the hoplites made use of heavy armor and tight battle formations called phalanx. The phalanx is one of the most famous and arguably one of the most simple infantry formations in military history. It consisted of rows of men carrying shields and spears. The shields would be locked together in front, and the first few rows of men pointed their spears forward as they marched, creating a deadly wall that advanced steadily towards their enemy. The prevalence of the hoplite tradition among the city-states was due to the fact that the decentralized governments could not requisition or maintain large armies, and thus relied on a small number of citizen soldiers to fight their battles. With the heavy armor and phalanx formation, casualty numbers could be kept at a minimum, which was necessary for the small population of the city-states. When facing other Greek armies in the field, the conventional tactics were for each side to form a phalanx and then slowly march towards each other until they collided, where they would then fight until one side's line was broken. When the Greeks tried these same tactics against the Persians in the Ionian revolt, the results were uniformly disastrous for the rebels. The slow-moving, tightly bunched hoplites were gradually picked apart by the Persian archers and cavalry, until a final cavalry charge finally routed them. It was this tactical discrepancy that caused the Persians to win every set-piece battle in the war, and likely gave them the impression that their armies were invincible against the Greek way of fighting. However, the Persian tactics had severe flaws that had not yet been revealed in the test of combat, and after the revolt, the Greek commanders that survived and fled back to Greece, awaited their chance to use what they had learned to get their revenge against the invaders. Now that we have gone over how each side fought up until this point, we will dive back into the narrative as Darius moves to conquer the West. While the Persians were definitely hungry for bloody revenge, they were still practical and wanted to avoid having to fight their way through every inch of Greek territory. To lessen the bloodshed and prevent the Greeks from uniting to face them, the Persians sent envoys to each city-state, offering peace if they willingly submitted to annexation. Having just seen their brothers in Ionia get walloped, every city except two capitulated to the Persians' demands. The two cities who did not immediately capitulate were the two strongest powers in the region, Athens and Sparta. Both the Athenians and Spartans executed the envoys Persia had sent, though probably not by kicking them into a pit while screaming, "This is Sparta." This insult was seen as a declaration of war, and Darius mobilized his armies to begin the invasion. The army gathered on the southern coast of Anatolia in Cilicia. Under the command of Datis, who had successfully led the campaign of the Ionian Revolt, and Artaphernes, the son of the satrap Artaphernes who had impaled and beheaded Histiaeus. In 490 BC, they set out on 600 ships to begin their campaign by besieging the island fortress of Rhodes. The defenders successfully prevented the fortress from falling, and the Persian army was forced to move on. The next stop on Datis and Artaphernes' bloody cruise through the Aegean was the old island of Naxos. Naxos had previously been attacked by our old friend Aristagoras in the failed siege that had been the prelude to the Ionian Revolt. Apparently, the Persians also held a grudge against the Naxians. Petty grudges are appearing to become the defining characteristic of Persian foreign policy. This time, the Persians had a much larger force, and rather than try and defend the city, the Naxians fled into the mountain. The Persians burned the city and enslaved anyone they could get their hands on. This process was repeated as the army hopped from island to island, enacting their revenge on as many Greeks as they could, before finally turning to start the invasion of Greece proper. It was time for yet another grudge settlement, this time with the city of Eretria, who had sent troops to aid the rebels who had burned Sardis. Rather than try and prevent the invasion fleet from landing, the Eretrians decided to try and hold out behind their walls until the Persians got bored or help arrived from Athens and Sparta. But no help was coming, so after a bloody 6-day siege, Eretria was betrayed by two men who opened the gates for the Persians. The Persians then proceeded to completely destroy the town while looting anything of value and enslaving the entire population. Learning that a city so close to them had just become the most recent victim of the ruthless Persian invasion, Athens quickly moved to raise their army and called for aid from their allies. They managed to muster around 10,000 hoplites, with 1,000 more arriving from their ally, the lesser city of Plataea. The Athenian armies were under the overall command of an elected war archon named Callimachus, who was supported by 10 generals, each elected from a different tribe. The democratic nature of Athens ran deep in the army command structure, and the supreme command rotated each day to a different general. The most important, for the purpose of our story, of these was Miltiades. Miltiades was an Athenian nobleman who had been tyrant of Chersonese. His uncle had first established the colony in 555 BC, before dying in 520 BC and leaving his titles to his nephew, Miltiades' older brother, Stesagoras. In 516, Stesagoras died, having had an axe embedded in his skull, a usually fatal affliction, so Miltiades became tyrant. As it seems to be with every notable general on both sides of the Ionian Revolt and now the First Greco-Persian War, Miltiades served the Persians after being annexed during the Scythian campaign. Though he was shown to be a very reluctant participant when he was left to defend a bridge on the Danube, and tried to entice his fellow Greeks to destroy the bridge and strand the Persians in enemy territory. After Darius caught wind of the attempted betrayal, Miltiades was forced to flee back to his homeland. However, when the Ionian revolt broke out in 499, he returned to Kyrenes and joined in the revolt. After the revolt was crushed in 493, he was once again forced to flee back to Athens. The democratic Athenians were not very enthusiastic in welcoming a former tyrant into their city, having just recently thrown out their own. A trial ensued where Miltiades had to defend his character and convince the people to accept him. To this end, Miltiades cited his participation in the Ionian revolt as proof that he truly cared for Greek freedom, and furthermore, that he had learned valuable weaknesses in the Persians' military tactics that would be useful in future conflicts with the empire. This argument swayed the trial to his advantage, and Miltiades was welcomed back into the city. Soon after, the envoys from Persia arrived to deliver their ultimatum, and it was Miltiades who suggested that the Athenians execute them. Having now taken the first lives of the war, Miltiades would soon get the chance to prove his military knowledge against the Persians as the invaders landed in a bay only 27 kilometers north of Athens. The name of the bay, and the plain nearby that the decisive battle would take place on, will likely be known even to listeners who have only a cursory knowledge of history or track and field sports. I am of course talking about the famous Marathon. Now when the Athenians learned that the Persian fleet had landed at Marathon, Miltiades implored them to march out of the city and meet the Persians in battle before they could leave the narrow plain of Marathon. Miltiades saw this spot as the perfect theater for engagement because the plain was flanked by rocky, uneven land on one side and marshes on the other. Having seen firsthand the effective way cavalry had been used to harass the phalanx, and knowing how much the Persian tactics relied on this advantage, Miltiades sought to nullify them using the terrain. Even without the threat of the Persian horses, the Greeks were outnumbered over 2-1, and thus sent their best runner, a man named Phidippides, to Sparta to reinforce them at Marathon. Phidippides ran the entire 140 miles in just one day, only to be told by the Spartans that they were a little busy having a festival right now, and so they wouldn't be able to join the battle for at least 10 days. Luckily for the Athenians, back in the day, set-piece battles were usually preceded by a very tedious staring contest. I'm being sarcastic here, but it is not entirely a joke. It was a general strategy that each army would set itself in formation on the battlefield and weigh their chances of victory on each particular day. If neither commander saw an overwhelming advantage, the two sides would watch each other until the sun went down, only to pack up and try again tomorrow. If the Greeks could keep this stalemate going for 10 days, their reinforcements would arrive and the tides of the battle would surely be in their favor. As the Athenian generals rotated their command, they each deferred to Miltiades, since he had the most experience fighting the Persians. After the 4th day of waiting and sizing each other up, it seemed the Persians were the ones to blink first, when they embarked their cavalry, perhaps to sail behind the Greeks and strike them from the rear, or to avoid this army entirely and attack the undefended city of Athens. Either way, the Persian infantry was left alone on the plain when the two sides formed up on the 5th day. Coincidentally, this 5th day was also the day of Miltiades' real command, and he formed the Greek lines differently than they had previously. Instead of having evenly distributed ranks, Miltiades had the flanks strengthened at the cost of the center lines. This was an unusual tactic, as it was commonly believed that if you lost your center in a battle, the flanks would be divided and picked off. Aside from this unorthodox formation, the Greeks also had to contend with the disadvantage of facing an enemy double their number. Because of this, they had to further thin out their lines so that they matched the length of the Persian lines to avoid flanking maneuvers. Despite the fact that the defenders benefited from delaying the battle, Miltiades decided to attack on the fifth day. We don't know why he decided to attack rather than wait, but there are a few theories that could all be true or could all be false. We have no way of knowing. One is that Miltiades saw the absence of the cavalry and believed that the Persians were now weak enough to defeat without the help of the Spartans. This idea also ties into the theory that the Greeks assumed the missing cavalry were going to attack Athens and that they needed to finish this battle as quickly as possible so they could return home to defend their city. Another theory is that Miltiades wanted to attack on his day of command in order to not share in either the glory of victory or the shame of defeat. A third theory is that the Persians were actually the ones to begin offensive maneuvers on this day, and seeing them do this, the Greeks hastily began attacking to preempt them and gain the advantage that offensive maneuvers gave them. Whatever the reason, the fifth day on the fields of Marathon would be one of the most famous days in Western historical canon. The attack began in the textbook manner as the Greek hoplites slowly marched towards the Persian lines. But once the phalanx had reached the effective range of the enemy archers, about 200 meters, Miltiades once again broke orthodox and commanded his lines to sprint at the enemy. This is something the Greeks had never done before and was thought to be impossible, as the heavy armor of the hoplites would tire the troops out and render them impotent once they reached the enemy. Despite this prevailing sentiment, Miltiades knew that a quick advance would catch the Persians off guard and limit the effectiveness of the archers they relied on. As the two sides made contact, the Persians quickly pressed the weakened Greek center back until they fully broke them and began advancing towards the pass the Greeks had been defending. However, the Persians did not realize that the strengthened Greek flanks had completely overcome their rivals and were now turning to envelop the center. Caught between the regrouped center and the advancing flanks, the Persians panicked and fled back towards their ships in an unorganized mob. Some groups of Persians were driven towards the swampy marshland near where they had landed, and, unaware of this hazard, drowned. Despite the crushing defeat on the battlefield and the chaotic retreat, most of the Persian boats were able to escape being captured. They would leave behind over 6,000 of their dead comrades. The invasion force was obviously shaken by this loss, but did not immediately call off their conquest of Greece. They instead surmised that they could snatch victory from the jaws of defeat if they sailed directly from Marathon to Athens and sacked the city before the Greek army could return. The Athenians presumed this would be their objective, and so returned home at a tremendous pace to stop the Persians from landing, leaving a small force at Marathon. This force was met by the Spartans, who had arrived just after the battle, took a look around the scene, and praised the Athenians for a job well done. Thanks for nothing, guys. Meanwhile, seeing that Athens was no longer undefended, Datis and Artaphernes sailed back to Asia to raise a larger army and return to finish the job. But before we get to that campaign, which would come to be known as the Second Greco-Persian War, I want to talk a little more about what the First Greco-Persian War meant for both the people at the time and Western historians in the future. The contemporary Greeks saw the Battle of Marathon and their victory in the First Greco-Persian War as a massive blow to Persia and tyranny. To them, Marathon proved that the hoplite phalanx, and by extension free citizen armies, could face up against the mobile missile combined tactics of the Persian mercenary armies. Going forward, they would choose to face them on terrain that hindered cavalry and close the distance between the lines quickly to negate the Persian advantages. Furthermore, the battle was an example of an idea that military theorists laud to this day, that disciplined troops can defeat much larger armies. It was steely resolve and the morale given from defending one's home that helped the Greeks crush an army twice their size just as much as any other tactical factor. The citizen militia had much more desire to fight and die than the massive Persian army of slaves and mercenaries. In addition to proving that the Persian military could be defeated by Greek armies, the First Greco-Persian War reinvigorated the desire for independence among the other Greek city-states, who had originally capitulated to Darius's demands. This would prove a decisive factor in the coming Second Greco-Persian War. On the other side, the Persians were less impressed by the Battle of Marathon. They saw it as a temporary delay of their inevitable victory. The 6,000 or so troops that they had lost were barely a scratch to the massive resources the empire possessed. To them, one battle was hardly the end of the conquest, and with a much larger force, they would effortlessly sweep aside the troublesome Greeks in the next campaign. However, that campaign would be delayed by a revolt in Egypt and then the death of the Persian king Darius. To future Western historians, the triumph at Marathon would be used as an example of freedom defeating tyranny and the West's superiority over Eastern despots. This example would be used in propaganda for over 1,000 years, even to our modern day, with Zack Snyder's films 300 and 300: Rise of an Empire, taking inspiration from various events in the Greco-Persian Wars. The Battle of Marathon would also be used to mark the birth of the classic Greek civilization we know today, but more on that in future episodes. To refocus ourselves on the overall subject of this series, we should talk about what was going on in Byzantium at this point in time, and specifically why they didn't join in the First Greco-Persian War. The loyalty of Byzantium has fluctuated a few times in the period we have discussed so far. First, they were an independent Greek city-state on the border of the Persian Empire. Then, during the Scythian campaign, they aided King Darius and were nominally incorporated into the Persian Empire. Until, during the Ionian Revolt, they declared themselves independent, but did not send troops or ships for the initial campaigns. Towards the end of the revolt, they were captured by Histiaeus' army from Lesbos and used by him in his final campaign against the Persians. After the revolt was put down, Darius' son-in-law, Mardonius, resubjugated Byzantium and the rest of the province of Thrace. Throughout all these changeovers, much of the city was damaged or destroyed, and many of its inhabitants fled, either back to Greece proper or to the other city-states in Anatolia. Because of this, Byzantium was still recovering when the First Greco-Persian War broke out and was in no position to resist the invading Persians. Due to the delayed start of the Second Greco-Persian War, Byzantium will have a much bigger part to play in the next episode. I want to end today's episode with a bit of fun trivia about why running events were named after a famous battle from antiquity. The myth surrounds the Greek runner Phidippides, whose job it was to ask for Sparta's aid in the battle. It is said that he ran the entire distance from Athens to Sparta, about 225 kilometers or 140 miles, in one day. Luckily, modern running events did not use this distance. Instead, they used the distance that the Athenians marched from Marathon to Athens, about 40 kilometers, to intercept the Persian fleet before it could land and effectively ended the First Greco-Persian War. The whole myth gets jumbled, as many myths do, as different historians and storytellers throughout the ages changed around names and distances and other details. But the use of the name Marathon to describe a race event began with the first modern Olympic Games in 1896. As the modern Olympics tried to emulate and invoke the memory of classical ancient Greece, they chose this name of an iconic battle and used the not at all round distance of 42.195 kilometers, which makes half marathons the even more inane distance of 21.0975 kilometers. I wonder how many half marathons actually measure out to the exact centimeter. Next time, we will be going over the Second Greco-Persian War, and as always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and join me next time for round 2 of the Greco-Persian Wars.